Good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to invite to the talk today Nick Skipworth-Michell, who is quite an interesting character. I've read his synopsis that he sent me, and it's a story based more on humanity than any of the sort of gung-ho antics that a lot of us got up to. But nonetheless, it's a very interesting story, and he's written two books, which we'll discuss later. The one is called Out on a Limb, which will become self-evident in the talk why it's called that. But having read the book, I found it really interesting, and it evoked thoughts in my mind of that film with Charlie Sheen called Platoon, where it was narrated in the first tense, so to speak, first person. And there was just one comment in there that sort of evoked a small amount of genius, where he stood on the banks of Kariba Dam and watched the Hueys skimming low over the water coming back from a raid. So, Nick, great to meet you at last. We've chatted behind the scenes through email and text messages for a long time, and it's nice to have you on board at last. I'd like to hand over to you now and just basically start off from the beginning.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, nice to chat to you as well. When you say the beginning, do you mean the beginning in terms of 1961 or the beginning of what?
Well, basically who you are, where you come from, and what brought you to the army.
Okay, I was born in Rhodesia, 1961, in Salisbury at the Lady Chancellor. I was brought up in Rhodesia, educated and schooled for most of my education in Rhodesia. I'm an ex-Oriel boy. Only went to Oriel Boys for a year. And then my mother, I think, saw the writing on the wall, having had three boys, and thought we need to maybe relocate to another country with the war spinning out of control and national service coming up. So we were whisked off, and I was then ensconced in an English boarding school, which was a bit of a culture shock for myself, coming out of Rhodesia and going straight into a wintry English boarding school. So I completed my education in UK at boarding school. I left UK, but still had a great interest in what was happening in my home country, and the war was being reported daily in the newspapers and on television, and panorama reports and ITV reports. And so I followed it intensely. After leaving boarding school, I worked for a short period of time, about a year, in the hotel industry, just really, earning a wage. And then made the decision and told my mother that I was going back to Rhodesia to join the army. And she said, well, over my dead body, I'm certainly not paying for your fare. So I said, no, that's fine. I'll pay for my fare. I'll go. And to soften the blow, I said, I'll go and join the police force. So she was quite happy with that. And I earned the fare, which I think was, I can't remember in those days, £300. It could have been maybe less. And packed up my bags and left the shores of England to go back to Rhodesia to ostensibly join the BSAP.
And at what age was that, Nick?
That was, I just turned 17, so I was 17 years old. I applied to the police at their headquarters in Salisbury, and they said, yeah, sorry, you're not tall enough and your weight is not proportionate. And the police, there's all sorts of rules and regulations concerning how you have to fit the mold. So I thought, okay, I'll then try the Air Force, because that seemed like a fairly sort of, fanciful position to hold, a chopper technician or one of those things. And they said, no, sorry, you don't have the right qualification. So here I was now kicking around in Salisbury, running out of options, and thought, well, okay, I've always had an interest in medicine, and always, before leaving school, thought I was going to be a doctor, but just didn't maybe have the fortitude or intelligence to become a doctor or go on to A levels. So I thought I'll join the Rhodesian Army Medical Corps.
So does that infer that you actually never finished any formal education like O level or A level?
No, I did finish O level, but O level was, or should I say M level, which we had in Rhodesia. In UK, it was taken away. So you went straight from O level to A level. And they said, look, I didn't particularly want to stay at school. I didn't enjoy it. And word from the teachers was that, well, it's going to be a hard slog for him to achieve A levels. And I was quite happy with that comment and thought, that's fine. I'll leave after O level. So I had O level qualification and left with that. So yeah, I duly went down to the Army recruiting office in, I think it was Baker Avenue, and signed up for the Army to be enrolled with the Rhodesian Army Medical Corps, who said that I would be posted on attestation into 1 Battalion RLI for my training.
Were you able to choose that designation, or was it purely because you couldn't get into any other units that one was available?
No, it's all a bit hazy, but I think I went down to Army recruiting and said I'd like to join. And they said, well, what unit would you like to join? And I said, well, Rhodesian Army Medical Corps, because I had an interest in becoming a medic. So they said, that's fine. Give us all the documentation that's required, and you're in, type of thing. So yeah, no, it was my choice as a sign-on regular. And from there, well, that was on a Friday afternoon. So they said, all right, you're in, report to KG6 barracks on Monday morning to pick up your kit and be transferred to Cranbourne barracks. So my first weekend in the Army was actually an off weekend. I had Saturday and Sunday to myself, which was quite nice. And then, yeah, I got down to KG6 on the Monday morning, had all my kit thrown at me by some disinterested sergeant quartermaster.
Yeah.
Packed it all into a bag and climbed onto a Land Rover for delivery into Cranbourne barracks. That's how I sort of got into the Army.
That's really quite remarkable. I mean, what sort of feelings and emotions were going through you at that point? Did you feel a sense of relief that you were achieving your goal, or did you have any doubts as to what you'd done?
No, at that point of time, Tony, it was my absolute dream. I'd spent, as I said, my life in UK compiling scrapbook cuttings of what was happening in Rhodesia, and I was a fairly good artist in those days. So I was drawing pictures of various Rhodesian soldiers, and it was almost like a dream had come true. And to the point that on the first night that I got into RLI, I was instructed by the training troop instructor to go and get a haircut, because I'd obviously just come out from UK. So somebody was appointed to escort me down to the RLI hairdresser. And we sort of ambled casually across the rugby fields at about 6 o'clock in the evening, I think it was. And as this happened, there was basically 4 or 5 alouettes that came in with the spotlight suddenly came on, and they were deploying troops back into barracks. And we had to hurriedly sort of run off the rugby field. And I sat there watching these troops deplane from the alouettes and thought, gosh, this is a reality check. This is what I've been after, and here I am. Almost a pinch yourself moment. It was short-lived, because obviously my return to training troop, that wasn't the reality as such.
Do you remember what year that was that you were walking across the field?
Yeah, that was 79, beginning of 79. So I can almost tell you the date. I think it was the 23rd of March, 1979. Got down to the barber's shop. He was closed. The guy that escorted me down was an ex-Israeli soldier, if I'm not mistaken. He said, well, let's pop into the Troopies bar and have a quick beer, which was highly illegal. But we had a very quick beer, and then we scurried back to training troop. So that was my first night's introduction to the RLI.
That's amazing.
I then spent, I think it was 3 or 4 days in the RLI training troop. Obviously being shouted at, screamed at, told to run from here to there. I performed pokey drill in the morning without a rifle because I hadn't had an opportunity to go to the armour and get a rifle. So everyone else was doing pokey drill with a rifle, and I was there without a rifle. I felt sort of quite stupid, really. And then after 3 or 4 days, the training troop instructor, and I think his name is Mike Orolski, I remember him very, very clearly, said this guy is too late as a regular intake to carry on. He needs to be back squatted and join the next intake. So as I was signed on Army Medical Corps, I was sent off to base group and told to hang around Camp Hospital until the next intake came in. So that was 163 that I joined, and I was back squatted to join 164.
To put this in perspective, I think you were 17 at that point in time, weren't you?
Yes, I was. Yeah. Yeah.
Incredible.
And at that moment in time, while I was hanging around in Camp Hospital, Operation Enterprise, which is my first book, was happening. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the date of deployment to Op Enterprise is the 7th of April. So it was literally 2 or 3 weeks after I joined the Army. I'm not sure whether it's because they didn't know what to do with me or because they had a shortage of medics out in the field, and they said, right, let's give this guy a quick 1 hour's training in the MI room, rifle drills, what to take with you on a bush trip, all the rest of it, medics pack, what to take. And it was the late Dave Reichert who gave me my weapons instruction. And I was told to go and join the mobile operating unit, surgical unit, resuscitation unit. It went under a varied amount of names at Enterprise Fire Force Base. So
I find this
there
incredible.
I was.
Yeah. And you got to meet Doc Webster, who we've interviewed already. Is that correct?
Yes, correct. Yeah. The in situ doctor then was Doc Webster. So he received me at the MRU. I'm not sure if he was aware of the facts as to whether I was an untrained soldier at that point in time, but he sort of said, "Okay, well, put your kit down in the MRU on the right hand side." The MRU was set up. If you're not aware of the MRU structure, it was this caravan, if you like, that was a full-on mobile operating surgical unit. It was powered by a generator. It had a water bowser that supplied water. There were 2 tents that came out the side. The left-hand tent was a holding bay, which had 3 stretchers for incoming patients, and the right-hand side doubled up as staff quarters, which also had 3 beds, which is where the medical staff assistants were bedded.
I was a patient in one of them at Mabalahuta, so I'm very
okay. So you're well aware of what the MRU does and is like. Yeah. So that was me. I was barreled out to Enterprise, and this was my first mission. Embarrassingly enough, as we got to the Salisbury limits, I was sort of poked in my ribs and told to cock my weapon, which I did, but didn't do it with enough zest. So therefore, the round lodged and it just became a disaster. And I didn't know how to clear it. Remove the magazine, cock, hook, and look, all of that good stuff. So I had to hand my rifle to the guy next to me who sorted it out. So that was my first, sort of embarrassing situation. Arrived at the
I find it incredible that they would send you out in that state of unpreparedness. But as you mentioned in your book, they were at that stage of the war getting really desperate for medics.
Yes, yeah. So ostensibly, I was going out there to just help out in the MRU as a medical assistant, albeit an untrained medical assistant. But there were certain requirements militarily in terms of cocking your weapon when you leave the Salisbury city limits and all that sort of stuff. So yes, I spent the duration of Operation Enterprise at the MRU. There was a steep learning curve, certainly in terms of approaching incoming Alouettes, which were coming into drop off casualties. I hadn't, obviously, not being through training troop, I hadn't done any chopper drills. So I had no idea of the 1 o'clock crouch position, wait for the thumbs up from the pilot before you approach, and all that sort of stuff. So I happily went running out to go and assist with the first stretcher that I'd seen coming in. And the chopper pilot, sort of in panic, went back up again. I had someone screaming at me and told me to sit down and wait, and this is what you must do. And he duly landed, and I learned very quickly that this is the drill to do.
Yeah, I think sucking up a stretcher into his rotors is not his.
Yeah, no, of course, yeah.
Yeah.
Or beheading a medic who's approaching on the wrong side at the wrong time. Yeah,
yeah, which
anyway,
happened.
Yeah, this was my learning curve, and I performed, not performed, but I assisted in quite a few operations that were being conducted. In my book, it's written, I think you probably have seen that one of the first casualties that came in was one of ours who'd been shot in the back. It was a straight through and through. There was nothing, no organs hit nothing, but there was this procedure of cutting from entry to exit, debriding, and then stitching back up again.
And did the sight of blood and all that unnerve you? Were you up for it?
Initially, yes, it did. I thought I was okay with it, but the first couple of operations that I witnessed, I did feel decidedly queasy, and there was a squash court complex right next to where the MRU was set up at Enterprise Country Club. So I found myself on the first operation after that, sort of taking deep breaths of air in the squash court club.
And a gin and tonic from the clubhouse, I'm sure.
Yeah. So, but with, with more and more coming in and being witness to a lot more, it became sort of, a lot more easier, and it didn't affect me after a while.
It might be worth it at this point, if you're agreeable, Nick, to actually pick up the copy of that book, Operation Enterprise,
yes,
and show it to the camera.
That is Operation Enterprise.
Bring it a bit closer to the camera if you can.
Yeah.
Operation Enterprise. And do you want to just touch on that a little bit more? I found it quite interesting that although that operation took place, it's not highlighted in any of the talks or that I'm aware of. It might have been out of the 155 we've done. But can you just touch on that a little bit, expand on it a bit?
I think you have had an interview with Mike Norton, and I think he touched on it briefly in his, and it's important to mention here that I did this book in collaboration with Mike Norton.
Yeah.
Mike Norton was the BSAP Special Branch officer at Enterprise, and we met each other there, and I picked up his sit reps, for want of a better word, and got hold of Mike. This was, 3 years ago, and said to Mike, can I have permission to take your sit reps and put it down in a book form? He'd put it onto a blog site somewhere, that unless you knew the blog site, nobody would have ever read about it. So I said, well, I'd like to put it into a book form. And he gave me permission, and he sent me his sit reps, and I constructed a readable book out of it. So I changed the sit reps into sort of civilian speak, if you like, made it understandable, and took stories from a lot of the soldiers in RLI that I knew were there at the time. It was one commander that was based there, and I did a lot of work with one commander, so I knew a lot of the guys who were there, and they added in their 2 cents worth in the book. So yeah, to your point, it is a very interesting operation in that it wasn't publicized enormously, but it was probably the last and biggest internal operation of the war. After Operation Enterprise was all of the raids into Mozambique and Zambia and such like, and those obviously attracted a lot more attention. But as Colonel Bates says in the foreword, people were unaware of how much Salisbury, or certainly north of Salisbury in the whole Enterprise region, was under the control of ZANU.
Yeah.
And it was from intelligence reports and from special branch that questions were asked. How did they get into Salisbury and rocket the fuel depots? And how did they get into the fringes of Salisbury Airport and mortar bomb the runway and all of those sort of things? And that's when the sort of light bulb came on. They realized that these guys were operating very close to Salisbury and were infiltrating Salisbury. And that's when Operation Enterprise kicked off, and they deployed RLI out to Enterprise Country Club, and it became one of the most successful, as I said, internal operations of the war, where certainly one commander claimed their ton for none, which had a T-shirt brought out almost immediately after the 100 kills.
For the sake of our foreign viewers, whereabouts is Enterprise? I think no more than 20 k's north of Salisbury. Is that correct?
Yes, if you go out on the Enterprise Road, which is the main arterial road leading out of the north of Salisbury, if memory serves me right, it's either slightly, I think it's slightly to the east, but it's almost due north. And as you say, 20 kilometers north of Salisbury. So the guys in the K cars and G cars were saying that if they were looking at the guns on the left-hand side and engaging the enemy, at the right-hand side, if they looked out there, they could see the outskirts of Salisbury, the Borrowdale Country Club and Borrowdale suburbs. So it was that close.
Wow. It's something, that I don't know how many of us were aware of it. Obviously, the RLI who fought in it were hugely involved, and people like Mike Norton, but it's quite astonishing that they had such a massive presence so close to Salisbury.
Who, the ZANU?
Yeah, that their numbers were as large as killing a ton of them, as you say.
No, it was almost their territory. They'd infiltrated it. While the army were busy outside of the sort of immediate perimeter of Salisbury, they were infiltrating all of the TTLs that were around that area. That's you'll have to read the book if you want all the detail.
Yeah. Can you expand slightly more on that area of operations, involving yourself? What did you actually do apart from patching up guys that came in? Your book mentioned that a number of them were the Charlie Tango variety as well that you patched up. Can you just enhance the being inside that tent working on these guys?
Yeah, it's written in the book. The obviously special branch worked very closely with the mobile resuscitation unit, so that any surviving insurgents that were brought in, first port of call would be to make sure that they are still breathing, and secondly to interrogate them and find out what was going on. So my first encounter with this was a Charlie Tango brought in. He had been fairly badly shot up in a contact. He had received a bullet through the forearm that had sort of come out behind the elbow. He had received a shotgun on the shoulder on the opposite side, and he had also received a bullet wound through the top of his foot that took quite a bit of his heel off. So he was in a fairly bad way. The doctor, Doc Webster, got busy on him. He was pioneering or experimenting with acupuncture as a form of anesthesia in those days, because obviously anesthetics and all drugs were hard to come by and weren't to be used flippantly or so it seemed fairly successful. He was pushing needles into this guy's shoulder and hitting nerves that he was supposed to be hitting, which was deadening the arm and allowing him then to sort out the elbow problem. The field dressing was slapped onto the guy's ankle, and that's pretty much all that happened on the ankle. But all the time there were two special branch officers around the operating table, asking questions of this insurgent who was being fairly non-committal and wailing about the pain and telling him that he's just a farm worker. He was caught up in the crossfire. He knows nothing. So Special Branch said, well, they had a little chat aside with Doc Webster, and before you knew it, the dressing came off the ankle, the drip came out, he was placed onto a stretcher and put outside the MRU. And he was told that, until such time as you start telling us the truth, we will start continuing with our medical treatment. Probably not Geneva Convention rules, but it certainly worked, because 5 minutes later the guy decided that he would disclose actually what was going on, and he was taken back in, and all the dressings and drips put back in, and a short while later was bussed off to Salisbury for further medical attention and no doubt further interrogation.
And
but yeah,
were you ever deployed by chopper to a forward scene at any point?
No, I wasn't. Being untrained, I desperately wanted to get on a chopper, and I heard that there were Kazovacs going on and they needed people to Kazovac out, but Doc Webster went on all of those. And I just hung back on the at the MRU to receive. The contacts were so close that we could hear them going on in the valley below Enterprise Club. So they were that close. The signal tent was right next to the MRU, so we heard all of the comms between the K-car pilots and the ground troops. So it was like being there but not being there. So in hindsight, probably a good thing, even though at the age of 17 I was very gung-ho and wanted to climb onto a chopper and go in and extract a couple of wounded soldiers, but it didn't happen.
And by the time you left there, how far had you advanced in your medical training, or what did you feel more comfortable doing?
I felt a lot more comfortable with the sight of blood. I felt a lot more comfortable with being able to do sutures, because that was a fairly inane job that I was given by the RMO. So I'd learned a great deal in terms of trauma medicine, put it that way. The ABCs, the airways, bleeding, chest wounds. D, it's getting all a bit scratchy now. E being evacuation. So I came away from there thinking, well, I've had probably a better preparation for my medics training course than most soldiers who go on medics training. So yeah, it was very shortly after that we all got, Enterprise was closed down, and we were sent back to Salisbury.
And what about setting up drips and administering painkillers and that type of thing? Did you get involved with that?
Yes, setting up drips. Painkillers, not so much. You had to go through the MA3 course before that to understand dosage, etc., etc. Certainly when handling morphine and that. So I was pretty much the MRU lackey. So yeah, putting up drips, doing stitches, putting on field dressings, taking off field dressings, cleaning wounds, that sort of stuff. But when it came to the clever stuff, that was left up to Doc Webster.
A brilliant doctor, I believe. And
yes.
How long did that operation last for? The one in Enterprise, a couple of months or longer?
No, the operation at Enterprise was a total of 14 days.
Wow.
From deployment to breakdown. It continued after that under the name of Operation Mulligan. I don't have too much detail on Mulligan, but I do touch on it at the end of Enterprise from the knowledge that I do know, which was the farmer's wife, whose surname was Mulligan. She was taken by the insurgents in a wheelbarrow, I believe, and tried to be taken into Mozambique.
I remember that.
Operation Mulligan was the follow-up, which also happened at Enterprise Country Club. But 3 Commando at that time were deployed to Enterprise to conduct operations to try and track down Mrs. Mulligan, who was being spirited away to Mozambique.
Mm.
I don't know the result of that, or too much detail about that, as I say. But yeah, Enterprise was 14 days. I'm not sure how many days after the beginning of Enterprise that I arrived, because the MRU was already set up. So I didn't go out with the deployment. I arrived a day or two later once everything was set up. And I recall that I was there for a week to 10 days before it was closed up and we were all sent back to Salisbury.
So the Op Enterprise came to an end. Can you tell us what happened after that?
Yeah, so we were all deployed back to Salisbury. I got back to Salisbury and rejoined Camp Hospital. It was still a while to go before 164 was about to kick off. So it was at that time then that I was lounging around again, learning medical skills at the Camp Hospital. And it was then that the lump behind my knee, which I'd had for a couple of years, but didn't hinder me or was not painful, was starting to increase in size and was now starting to become just an annoyance. So I thought, well, I'll go down to the sick parade in the morning, Doc Webster, and ask him for his opinion. And he looked at it and he immediately said, I think I need to refer you to Mr. Standish White in Andrew Fleming, which he did. I got down to Andrew Fleming, and Standish White, who had a group of interns with him, had a look at this and said to his interns, why is this not a cyst? Which got me a bit worried. And they had chats and what have you amongst them. And he said, I want to take a biopsy. So we're gonna book you in, send that away for testing, and then we'll let you know the result. Well, the biopsy came back the next day, and he said, this is a malignant growth behind your knee, and we're going to have to amputate the leg above the knee. So that was quite a shock. This was still age 17. This was in July 79, I think it was. So 3 or 4 days later, I checked myself out of Andrew Fleming Hospital against the instruction of the doctor, went and had a few beers with my mates and went for a run or two, knowing that the impending fate of my leg was going to happen on, I think I went in on the Thursday, and Tuesday it was going to come off. So checked myself back into hospital, and yeah, it was amputated on Tuesday. I was not quite sure what the future held, having just joined the army, having just got into everything that I'd dreamed of and aspired to, was now pretty much destroyed. And I thought, well, that's the end of my military career. They're going to medically discharge me, and I'm not sure what's going to happen. So fortunately for me, I went back to Camp Hospital after being discharged from hospital to recuperate and get fitted with a prosthesis. All of this was paid by the military, and I can't remember the discussions that took place. I don't think discussions did take place, but there was nothing to say that you're now going to get discharged from the army. We just carried on as if nothing had happened. It's here you are. A month later, you get fitted with your prosthesis, and I went back to Camp Hospital, had my prosthesis, and then they said, right, we're going to send you on a medic's MA3 course now. And I then went off in December of 79 to go and do my MA3 course.
Nick, I just can't believe that. I know you're talking with hindsight now from a long time ago, but at the time you must have been absolutely shocked out of your wits when you went to have a drink with your mates. You must have been horrified. I mean, in your book, you questioned why it was happening at such a young age, and you had far too much life still left to live. You must have had serious doubts. You even thought, why can't it be delayed so I can enjoy a bit more time before I have it done? What thoughts were going through your mind over that week or so before you had the operation?
Yeah, I did. I said to the doctor, and you rightly point out that I said to him, can I not delay this for at least a month or two so that I can, do what I need to be doing, because it's not painful, it's not getting in my way. But yeah, it was a great shock. They didn't tell me it was cancer at the time. They told me it was and at 17, you don't understand all these medical terms of malignant growth and that sort of stuff. And I didn't really understand why amputation was necessary. And it was my mate who had given me my weapons training in the MI room, Dave Reichert, who took me aside and said, nobody's told you yet. And I'm not sure why they're not telling you. Maybe it's for whatever reason, but you have cancer. And that's why they need to amputate the leg, because if they try and cut out the growth, there are two options. It's grown around the main sciatic nerve. Either they're not going to cut out enough and it'll go wild, or they're going to damage the sciatic nerve and then your leg's useless anyway. So he gave me a clearer picture than the doctor or the surgeon at the time. And I then understood that this is probably a good prognosis, is to have it amputated and get rid of everything that's there and not have to go repeatedly back and suffer the ongoing cancer. So it was a life-changing moment. I mean, at the age of 17, there are all sorts of things going through your mind about how you're going to drive cars, how you're going to get girlfriends, how you're going to do all sorts of stuff that normal teenagers do, dance and discos and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But it is what it is. So, you get on with it and learn to deal with it.
You described the procedure in the book and how they have to compress the stump down to a point where the prosthesis fits properly. Then you had problems with these phantom pains and phantom feelings. I'm sure other amputees listening to this will, understand it. But I believe you could feel your toes for years after the amputation.
Yeah, the phantom pains and feelings never go away. They're still here today, but they're pushed into the subconscious. It's when you talk about them, they suddenly pop up again. But they're not nearly as bad as they were post-operation. Post-operation, it is extremely painful because every sensation that the human mind can understand in terms of pins and needles, electric shock, cold, hot, any sensation is all happening all of the time, because the severed nerves are confused and they're sending messages back to the brain. So yes, your toes go into cramp, and there's nothing you can do about it. So those fellow amputees will understand all of those feelings, and they stay there for a good couple of months, maybe 6 months, and then after that they start to subside. But they, as I say, they're always there, but they're just pushed over the years into the subconscious.
But that's the power of the brain, which is an amazing organ. It can decide for itself that I don't want these impulses anymore, or I'm going to modify them. It's quite incredible.
Yeah. So that was me. I then got the prosthesis fitted, and very shortly after was sent down to Llewellyn Barracks to do my MA3 course, which, as you see in the book, came across with a few humorous stories of how it played into my favor by having this prosthesis.
Well, the story that touches me is how much beer you could get into it.
Yeah, it did become a drinking vessel. When you're with the RLI, and beer is a major part of your life. I remember an occasion in the Meikles Hotel, and I forget the name of the bar, but it was a very swish bar in the Meikles Hotel. With them deciding that it was a good idea to take my leg off and fill it with beer and pass it around to everyone.
I remember when I joined a mortar team, I was made to drink beer out of a 60ml mortar. That was my initiation, and I can sort of identify with drinking beer out of such a large vessel.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's excellent. Carry on with your story, Nick.
Okay, so yeah, there are various things that I mean, I did the MA3 course. We all, most of us passed the MA3 course. Was sent back to the RLI. Well, I wasn't actually sent back to the RLI. There was a mistake because I was signed on Army Medical Corps. RLI was my parent unit, but once you'd completed your MA3, they could decide as to where they posted you to. And somebody decided that it was a good idea to post me to the Air Force. So I got posted off to New Serum immediately after medics course. And I was a bit upset about this because, RLI had become my home. My mates were there, and I'd been on course with a few RLI mates. And I then went off to New Serum, and I spent 3 months at New Serum, which also was very interesting from a medical point of view because we were also treating incoming casualties that were being choppered in from the likes of places like Op Enterprise, but obviously that had closed. We were being deployed out by Islander to places like Ntoko to bring Casevacs in. So from a medical point of view, it was a good posting, but I never felt that was my home, and I continued to try and get a posting back to the RLI. And after 3 months, I got it right.
What did an MA3 course enable you to do with a wounded soldier?
An MA3 course was, you have medical assistance class 3, 2, and 1. 1 is you're almost a doctor. MA3 entitles you to dispense drugs, right up to morphine. You can perform minor amputations. You can hold sick parades in terms of just general, ailments, coughs, colds, all the rest of it. So you're pretty much a qualified nursing sister. I think it's probably on a par with a nursing sister. Administer drips. As MA3 was considered a commando medic. So below commando medic, you had the entry level, which was troop medic, which is very basic, just learn how to put a drip. Then you had stick medic, which was slightly more advanced, and then MA3, which is considered a commando medic. So he accompanied the commando with his commando medic's bag and was probably the medic below doctor level. So after MA3, you referred your patients to the doctor if you couldn't sort it out.
Mm.
So it was a well recognized medical sort of certification.
Do you remember any particular incidents that were quite challenging for you during that period?
Yeah, my first initiation was immediately I got back to RLI, but I wasn't there for a day or two before I went to the Air Force. But they had an initiation whereby incoming medics were tested. So it was all set up. The telephone would ring. I would be sent to answer the telephone, which I did. I answered the telephone. There was a desperate voice at the end of the telephone saying that one of the soldiers had fallen off the balcony at one of the commando blocks, and I was to come up. They think he's broken his leg. So I said, all right. There were a couple of medics just lounging around in the lounge. They said, well, no, you go sort it out. You're the new guy. So I went running off to get the medics, pack out the back room, grabbed the keys for the ambulance, rushed out to the front, turned over the engine for the ambulance. Naturally, it wouldn't start because they'd taken the rotor arm out of it. Came dashing back in to get the keys for the Land Rover, which was then going to be an uncomfortable Casevac in the back of a Land Rover. That also didn't work because they'd unplugged a whole bunch of necessary stuff. And now you're in quite a flap. You don't know what to do. You're trying to get to this casualty as soon as you can, and nothing's working. And as you dash out the door, they say, "Broken leg. Why haven't you got a splint with you?" And eventually, when you get all your stuff together and you're desperate and you don't know what you're going to do, they obviously break down laughing and say, "Well, there was your test. Now you need to learn from that. Get yourself organized and learn what you need to have with you at all times." Because at any moment, you could get a call. When I went to the Air Force, I was on duty for paradrops early in the morning, so they would have a parachute training school would have an early morning paratroop drop before sunrise. And there was always a medic deployed onto the DZ to attend to any injuries. Obviously, the ones done at night time or early morning when it was dark suffered the most injuries because troops couldn't see the ground before hitting. And the very first one was Colonel McKenna from RAR, who was doing a training jump, and he slipped into or fell into, landed in a donga in the field, and his heel pushed up between his tibia and fibia, and it was quite a bad break.
Oh.
Fortunately, it was because it was ensconced in his boot. There wasn't much that needed to be done, but the oak was in an enormous amount of pain, and I wasn't really quite sure then what to do with this, Oh. So I sort of put a splint on without taking his boot off and casevaced him off to Andrew Fleming. But it's a learning curve. You're taught a whole lot of stuff at MA3 or medics course, but these things present themselves that not necessarily being covered in medics course. The very next one, I was deployed with Doc Webster up to Mtoko to attend to 2 troops that had fallen off a water tower, and they were in bad shape. They were semi-comatose. I think the medic at Mtoko had done what he needed to do to casevac them. So all that was required for the doctor and I was to load them into the Islander and stabilize them and get them back to New Serum. And the doctor promptly went to sleep in the aircraft because he had done his job, and it was an hour's flight or whatever it was back to New Serum. And one of the troops on the stretcher was complaining bitterly that he needed to urinate, and what is he going to do? So I presented him with a drip bag cut off at the top, and said, well, okay, wee into this. And he couldn't, and he was in desperate pain, and nothing was forthcoming. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to wake the doctor up. This lowly corporal now interrupting the major having a sleep. Anyway, shortly after that, we landed at New Serum, and he was taken in, and the doctor was awake. And I advised him. I said, look, this guy's been screaming desperately to urinate, and nothing's forthcoming. So he took him into the MI room, and he said, well, we're going to have to catheterize him then. And he catheterized the guy, and it was like Victoria Falls coming out. And what had happened is he had broken his pelvis, and the pubis bone in the front had slipped down and restricted the urethra. So as much as he wanted to wee, he couldn't. And only once he got catheterized did it break through. And he was then subsequently casevaced off to Andrew Fleming. But yeah, as I said, all of these things were learning curves, from the standard MA3, gunshot through the head, gunshot through the chest, or common coughs and colds.
And I believe you remained in that capacity right up to the end of the war. And then what happened after that, Nick?
Yes. I got the transfer back to RLI from the Air Force 3 months. I was then subsequently transferred up to, and this is where I think the RLI didn't really know what to do with me. They sort of, operations were coming to an end and winding down. So they sent me up to Sanga Lodge as a patient. So I was there for a short while. And when I left there, Dick Paget said to me, he said, I'd like you to come back as staff. So very shortly after I returned, I went back to Sanga Lodge as a staff member. And that was a different aspect of medicine altogether, because it was treating post-injury, treating the psychological effects of injury. Dick Paget was a legend in himself, and conducted Sanga Lodge in a unique medical way. He had a warped sense of humor that didn't mimic or offend people, but made people laugh, and using their injuries. So I learned a lot from Dick Paget in terms of treatment, of psychological treatment of patients, physical treatment in terms of physiotherapy. And I was there for 6 months, and treated a lot of assisted mainly in the treatment of a lot of patients at Sanga Lodge. It was a unique experience.
So, have you listened to Barry Zoratin's talk on 119? Talk number 119.
I have. I'm in touch with Barry Swarenstein. I haven't. He sent me his book, which I've read. So yeah, I've had a lot of communication with Barry Swarenstein, but not as of late.
I went to Sanga Lodge a couple of times, just poking my head in out of curiosity, really, and I found it to be such a tranquil place up in the mountains with the pine trees and the cool air and all that sort of stuff. It was certainly a good place to recover from mental as well as physical trauma, wouldn't you say so?
Absolutely. It was a very limited patient amount, if you like, for want of a better word. So I think there were at any time probably only about 15 patients there. But as you say, it was very tranquil. It was a great environment for rehabilitation. You know, the only other rehabilitation centre was really St Giles in Salisbury, and they were processing so many injuries that the more severe, I would say, were the guys that were sent to Sanga Lodge, the guys that really had big physical challenges. I mean, I won't get into detail of what those injuries were, but they were very, very bad injuries. And then after that, Sanga Lodge, myself and a guy called Dickie Trumbull, the late Dickie Trumbull, he was an engineer who also went back as a staff member. He also suffered PTSD, and that was why he was at Sanga Lodge. He didn't suffer a physical injury. He lost it one day and he took a 2-5 off to, I think it was Mukumbura somewhere, reversed it up and just sent mortars off into Zambia just for the laugh. So they realized that he had sort of lost the plot and needed to go for some calming remedial attention. And him and I were the two rogues, if you like. We were fairly naughty. So Dick Paget eventually said, "Look, I'm going to have to send you guys off to somewhere else because you might not be a good fit for Sanga Lodge. You've been here too long, I think, in the mountains." So I was then subsequently posted off to Gwelo, and I ran the MI room at 10RR for a short while before finally being posted to School of Infantry, where I worked with the BMAT engineers in terms of going out and discovering arms caches and diffusing them and all of that sort of stuff, and the integration of assembly points, because it was all the assembly points at that point that had zipper and Zanler. And we went out and held medical parades for them.
Nick, before we go on to that, which we can talk about in a bit more detail, what was the type of therapy that would be given to guys suffering from PTSD? Was it just talking? Was it counseling? Was it getting them to share their inner thoughts? Was there any spiritual side of it that was used at all?
Dick Paget's wife was very religious. I think Dick Paget was quite religious, but he didn't make it known to many people. So there was a routine at Sanga Lodge. You got up, you had breakfast in the morning, you had tea after breakfast, and then you went off down to the gymnasium and you did physical exercise. After that, there was a skins and shirts basketball team between people in wheelchairs and people with one leg. It was quite humorous to watch, but anyway, it all added to the camaraderie. You then went up and had sort of late morning tea, and the rest of the day then was your own time. And I think that's when a lot of the PTSD talks were held by Anne, which was Dick Paget's wife, in the sort of main lounge of Sanga Lodge. You were encouraged to do art lessons, just express yourself, really. And I think that was more of their sort of PTSD treatment, was expression, as opposed to a psychologist sort of having a chat to you. So it was through discussion mainly, as opposed to psychologists.
Yeah, very interesting.
Then the afternoon you had lunch. The afternoon was then more formal activity. You then went horse riding or canoeing or did some kind of physical activity. The bar was only open for an hour in the evening from, I think, 5 to 6 o'clock, then dinner and then bedtime. So yeah, it was very relaxing.
Lovely. And then you left there and you say you went to 10th Battalion. Now that was when the war ended. You were actually in the Zimbabwean Army at that point, weren't you?
Yes, correct. Yeah.
And what was it like interacting with our enemy? It must have irked a lot of guys who stayed on for a couple of years. How were you treated? Were you treated badly by them?
No, it was at 10 RR. The integration hadn't fully happened. They were still in the assembly points. They were still trying to work out exactly what's going to happen, how they're going to integrate the army, who they were going to bring in, where. This was, I suspect it was when Mugabe was doing his whole, we're going to increase the force by 30,000 ZIPRA members. But none of the mechanics had been worked out yet. So they were all still lurking around in assembly points. And this is obviously what was the kickoff of the Intumbani uprising, which was when ZIPRA and ZANLA had a go at each other in Bulawayo. That started in Gwelo at the Connemara Lakes assembly point. And that very quickly then spilled down to Bulawayo, which is when the whole Intumbani uprising happened. So I was in Gwelo. I got to Gwelo shortly after the Connemara Lakes uprising, or Connemara uprising, which is when they were just ferrying dead soldiers from the assembly points into Gwelo and realized that there was a big problem at hand. So my time at 10RR was pretty much going out to the assembly points, conducting sick parades, and treating all the ailments that the guys had come in from the bush with. So I didn't really get involved in the punch-up of Intumbani. I was on the fringes of it, if you like. And then, as I said, I then went to School of Infantry, where BMAT were, for those that are not sure who BMAT is, was the British Monitoring and Training and Advisory Team. They were based at the School of Infantry, and they were also trying to work out how the integration would happen. At that point, there were officers from ZIPRA and ZANLA that were being schooled at the School of Infantry. It was when the new uniform was being issued, so there was a lot happening at that time, and there were these calls that were coming in under amnesty for arms caches that the engineers were going out to go and diffuse and sort out. So I was the accompanying medic on a lot of those. There was no, to answer your question, there was no animosity that I felt particularly. It was a very uncertain time for everyone. So I think ZIPRA were looking at ZANLA, ZANLA were looking at ZIPRA, and the Rhodesian Army were looking at both of them as well. All with equal mistrust and not knowing what the end game plan was.
And I believe both 10th Bat and the School of Infantry were still white officered, were they? But like very skeleton staffs?
Yes, 10 Bat was white officer. Major Carmichael, I think, was the officer commanding. All white, but as you say, very skeleton. I think there were probably 4 people at 10 Bat.
And that officers. Was like in 1982, am I correct in saying that?
It was the very end of 81, yeah. 81. End of 81. Yeah. And School of Infantry was still all white officers. Although there were a few black officers from the RLI obviously still there. And that was, going into very early 1982, I had an unfortunate accident in my flat in Gwelo where I slipped on the bath mat and broke the stump of my amputated leg, which is, that is pain that goes to a new level. So I spent my last month or 2 in bed before being discharged in March 1982.
Prior to that, how mobile were you with your procedure? Could you walk quite normally?
Yes, very, very, very mobile. I was deployed on a few exercises with RLI, because when RLI sort of, before they disbanded and at the end of hostilities, they weren't quite sure what to do with this infantry battalion. So they were sent off on various exercises, and I accompanied them on those exercises. So that was, bush camps and that sort of stuff. So, I was in bivvies. I was, for those that were being Kazovac through, there were two Kazovacs. There was a couple of Kazovacs with heat fatigue, and I was sent out to the Alouette to go and accompany and bring out the heat fatigue, and that was what I was quite my biggest challenge, was running under the blades with an artificial limb, because you can't crouch and run with an artificial leg. You've got the sort of Long John Silver swing out the side. So that was quite a challenge, but I didn't get decapitated. And then there was another one that I went on deployment with, or Kazovac with, was a guy who received a shrapnel wound to the back of the neck from a faulty French mortar bomb, and that was on exercise at Wafa Wafa in Kariba.
And were those still white personnel, or
yeah,
black soldiers by that point?
No, it was all white personnel, because it was the RLI, still the RLI before it had converted to one Zimbabwe Commando Battalion.
Yeah, crumbs, that's incredible. Nick, we're going to be closing off this talk fairly shortly. Could you just hold up your book to the camera, the one out on a limb?
Yeah.
I did my best to read it before we spoke, so that I can get an idea of who you are. It's well worth buying, and a very apt title, Out on a Limb. It's got many meanings to that. I just want to say that, you may feel that your story might have less value than others. Well, I just want to say that I think totally differently. I've been really impressed by your determination, your bravery, the way you went out to treat guys even without being trained. That took a lot of guts and balls, and I just want to honor you for coming back to the countries it was then, and fighting for Rhodesia when you could have opted out. So well done to you. And is there anything else you'd like to just touch on in conclusion?
No, thanks, Tony. I appreciate that. And yeah, as you say, I don't feel that my story is particularly unique, but it has to have a certain uniqueness. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to write a book about it. So
absolutely.
And yes, I think passion and desire to follow your dreams is important. And I'm fortunate in that I've been afforded what I have been afforded in life, and I've been able to do what I've been able to do in life.
And a tremendous love for your country shows through the whole thing.
Yes, yeah. So I thank you very much in closing for the opportunity to be able to do this interview, and I hope that it inspires a few other people to tell their story. And as you say, no matter how trivial it may seem to the individual, all the stories are important, and they're all vital to be put down for future generations to hear and understand.
Absolutely. As I've said before, all of our stories form a tapestry, and if somebody doesn't give their story, there's a thread missing. So
indeed.
I encourage everybody to come forward and talk, even the farmers' wives. I've said this before. They went through very trying periods. Nick, I just want to thank you. It's really been an uplifting and enlightening talk, and I'm sure it'll give a lot of hope, and the idea of going forward with dreams in other people's lives who've faced a similar challenge to yours. So thanks very much for coming on board, hey?
Thank you, Tony.
Okay. God bless. Bye-bye.
Cheers.